Before he retired, my dad was a carpenter for over 65 years, and he always advocated for using the right tool for the job. But he also, a lot of times, had to make do with what he had on hand. I think most of us try and find that one controller that's, good for everything, the all-arounder. The Mario in Super Mario Brothers 2, and that's absolutely a valid way to do it, especially if you want to save money. But I also think that there is something to using one controller for certain games and another controller for other games. So in today's video, I want to take a look at a bunch of different controllers that I have here in the NerdNest, and I want to go through each of them, talk about their features, I'll give them a rating, and then at the end, I'll talk about how I think each controller stacks up with the genres that I prefer to use it on. Now, I'm not saying that these are always going to be the best options, but they're the options that I prefer. Remember, this is all subjective. That said, if you disagree with me, let me know why down in the comments, and also in the description, I'm going to have links to anything that I mention here in the video. So if there is a controller that catches your eye or some other accessory that I'm talking about, you can find it down below that like button. And if you have a favorite controller that I didn't mention, let me know about it as well. I love testing out uncommon controllers or weird input methods. But before we get to the weird ones, I think it's important that we have a baseline in order to, with the most common controllers that are out there, the ones that everyone knows. As I'm making comparisons, I would want to be able to have something to compare them to. So I want to start today's video with the Xbox Series controllers. This one is the one that I think is the base model, the one that is the most common and the one that I can compare most things to. So we'll use the $60 Xbox Series controller as our baseline. I think of all of the main controller manufacturers, Microsoft is the one that offers the most customization. You can make it whatever color you want, which is great, but they also are way behind the times when it comes to new features. That said, there's a reason a lot of people love this controller. Let's take a look at the sticks first. Xbox sticks have been offset since day one. Some people love offset sticks and some people hate offset sticks. For me, I don't really care either way. I think whatever it is that you're using, you're going to get used to it. I think inline sticks is fine, and I think offset sticks is fine. But let's talk about the sticks themselves. First of all, these have a nice deep scoop at the top, which I really like. I can't stand when sticks have a dome top. I very much prefer to have a place where my thumb just sits, but that's just me. These are also potentiometer sticks, so over time they are more likely to get drifty. I'd like them to be Hall effect sticks, but that isn't what Xbox does. These feel really smooth as you roll through the motions, and there's just the right amount of grip on the edge of the stick. I give these sticks an A. Next up, let's look at the D-pad. I think of all of the D-pads that I'm going to talk about today, this one is my favorite. I remember when the hybrid D-pad first came out, I thought that I would hate it just by looking at it, but I think it's great. That said, I'm not a fighting game guy. Most of the games that I'm playing using this controller, they're the kind of games where you just need the D-pad to be a weapon selector or, something like that, or maybe for platforming. And honestly, this D-pad is really comfortable for me. It's recessed. It's got a nice low point in the middle that has that upward slope on the outside. It's also really clicky and satisfying when you use it. Here's the Iron Meat test, where I duck down with my character, and then I rock the down button back and forth to see how often I get accidental dialogues when my character starts moving. I have to say, this controller does better with this test than any other controller that I've tested. Next up, I like to test it for Street Fighter as well, and I can easily pull off Hadoukens and Shoryukens with the D-pad on the Xbox. It gets an S rank. Onto the face buttons. I think that the face buttons, they feel really good. They're big and they're kind of rounded on top. My preference is for flatter buttons on the top, kind of like the Nintendo Switch Pro controller, but these are also great. They also kind of form fit to the face of the controller, so all four buttons stick up the same amount above the shell. I really do like that. I also like how the rounded tops make just a little bit easier to hit two buttons at the same time. So if you're playing a game like upcoming Monster Hunter Wilds, for instance, pressing Y and B at the same time is going to be very easy to pull off. But that also means that you might do it by accident. So I think the buttons, they're good, but nothing to write home about. I'm going to give them a B. Triggers on the Xbox controller are also fine. I know that they have trigger rumble, which is a pretty cool feature, but most of the time I just forget about it. They also have enough travel, so I always feel like I can feather the trigger if a game needs me to do that, like in a racing game. I also really like the amount of resistance I feel when I'm pulling on the triggers on the series controllers. Again, they're good, but they're not exciting, so I think they get a B. People have really intense feelings about rumble. They either require rumble or they despise rumble and always have it turned off. I think that the rumble in the Xbox controller is pretty great, and the fact that the triggers have rumble as well kind of pushes the rumble up to an A for this controller, which brings me to my biggest gripe with the Xbox Series controller, and that's the lack of gyro. I know a lot of people don't care about gyro, but for those that do, gyro is super important. For me, gyro is super important, and Xbox doesn't offer any gyro. Honestly, I feel like right now, Microsoft is holding back the entire industry by not including gyro. Because of if a large portion of customers who buy a game can't use gyro as a feature, then why would the devs go through the trouble of supporting that feature? Which is why tons of games lack gyro support. I can't assign a grade to gyro because it doesn't have it, so I figured I wanted to give Microsoft an F just for effort, but I guess I just have to leave it at NA. Next up is comfort. I think the Xbox controller is incredibly comfortable. It kind of melts away in your hands. Anyone that prefers inline sticks is going to disagree with me. I'm absolutely sure about that, but I personally think this controller is S-tier comfort. Before I move on to other controllers, I want to say that one massive advantage that the Xbox controller has over all of the other controllers in this video is its batteries. It's just straight up AA batteries. So if your controller dies, you can swap them out and you are right back into the action in no time flat. I even have some of these rechargeable batteries for the Xbox controller if my controller dies, so I could just swap this one out and always have another one charging. So it's super easy to keep going if my battery is getting low. And again, like I said before, links down below. Sony's DualSense controller is probably the most feature-rich controller you can get at $75. It is expensive, but you're getting a lot of functionality for that price. Let's start things off with the sticks. The sticks are inline. Some people are going to love that. Some people are going to hate that. I feel like they have about the same resistance as the Xbox controller. There's an indent for your thumb on the top of the stick, but it isn't as deep as the Xbox controller, which is one of the things that brings this stick from an A down to a B for me. The D-pad is softer and mushier compared to the Xbox One. It does pretty well on the Iron Meat test. Here you can see that I'm moving back and forth a little bit, but not too much. It's easy to hit a diagonal when you want to, and it's hard to hit a diagonal when you don't want to, but it isn't anywhere close to the performance of the Xbox controller for the D-pad. In Street Fighter, Hadoukens are easy enough, but I was a little less accurate when I was trying to do the Shoryukens. It could be a skill issue, but I just find it way easier to get those inputs on the Xbox controller, probably because of the shape of it. The D-pad on the DualSense gets a B. Just like the D-pad, the face buttons feel softer and mushier than the Xbox controller. They're responsive, but they're not clicky. They're flatter than Xbox, and they're well placed. Overall, I do like them, and I like the flat shape on top, so the face buttons get a B. The triggers on the DualSense are top-notch. Sadly, most of their features aren't going to be implemented in 99% of games on PC. And even if they are implemented, you can't play wireless on PC if you want to take advantage of those features. But on PlayStation and on PlayStation Studios games on PC with a wire, this controller shines. The triggers have a decent throw, they have good resistance, but they also have variable resistance depending on what game you're playing. So for instance, when you're playing games like Gran Turismo 7 and you're hitting the brakes, the faster you're going, the more resistance you hit when you hit the brakes. In shooters, when you pull the trigger, you get lots of resistance up until that point when the shot is fired, and then it clicks. It feels fantastic, and I hope all controllers steal these features because they are freaking great. Based on me raving about these, you'd think that I would call the triggers on the DualSense an S tier, but they get docked down to an A tier for reasons I'm going to get to later on in the video. DualSense has rumble as well as haptics, and I have to say, when playing a game like Astrobot, for example, Sony's vision for this controller is on full display. Again, to get most of these features on PC, you have to play a game that supports it, which isn't very many, and you have to play wired, but when you do, it is absolutely an amazing experience. For me, the DualSense is S tier for rumble and other feedback, and it also has gyro, and the gyro works great. However, it's missing one thing that would make the gyro S tier. For now, I'm going to say that it's an A for gyro, and I will explain later on why it doesn't get S tier. Though, if you watch my videos on the regular, I'm betting that you can guess why. I think the DualSense is an A for comfort. It's great, don't get me wrong, but I do prefer the shape of the Xbox controllers. That being said, I could play on this controller for hours with no complaints, and I have, which brings me to my biggest complaint about this controller. My biggest gripe with the DualSense is its absolutely abysmal battery life. I also have this charger, which I just set my controller in when I'm done. It usually takes a second for me to get the pins lined up so that the controller starts to charge, but it's better than swapping batteries all the time. However, if you're someone that does play games for really long periods of time, you're likely to run this thing into the ground more often than not. And if you don't have a second controller around that's charging while you're waiting, then you have to rely on a wired connection. And with the baseline controllers out of the way, let's move on to third-party controllers. And we are starting with the King Kong 2 Pro controller, which retails for about $70. Let's start with the sticks. They're offset like Xbox, and they have different size stick caps so that you can swap them if you want a longer throw for aiming in first-person shooters. These sticks are also Hall effect sticks, which means you're going to hear a lot of people say that they can't drift. Hell, I've probably been guilty of saying this kind of thing in the past myself. The way Hall effect sticks work is they use electromagnets to sense which way you're tilting the sticks, which means they're less prone to wear and tear over time and less likely to develop drift as early as a potentiometer based stick would develop drift over time. Though I've never actually experienced drift on a Hall effect sticks. Gully Kit claims that they have no dead zone. Here you can see my dead zone test for the controller, and that jump right there is really strange to me. So these sticks, they get a C from me. The D-pad does a fantastic job, better than the DualSense, but not as good as Xbox. In Street Fighter, I'd say it's really good for Hadoukens and Shoryukens, but in the Iron Meat test, you're definitely going to get more accidental diagonals than on an Xbox D-pad. I think the D-pad on the King Kong controller, I'm going to say that that's A tier. The face buttons are nearly identical to Xbox, although they do feel a little bit more resistive, but for the most part, it feels almost like the same experience to me, so it's a B. Triggers are C tier, mostly because they just don't feel like there's very much resistance to them. I don't like playing racing games on the controller. I'd like more pushback from the controllers that I get, although they are Hall effect triggers. The rumble is fine. You can adjust it by holding the gear icon and then pressing up or down on the D-pad. That is a feature that I like a lot, so that you have the ability to dial in how intense you want the rumble to be. So I would give the rumble a B on this controller. While this controller does in fact have gyro, Steam detects it as an Xbox controller, so you can't use the gyro that it has unless you trick it into thinking that it's a Switch controller by doing a couple button presses on the back. The disadvantage there is that the triggers on a Switch controller are digital, so you have to make a choice. You can either have gyro or you can have analog triggers. I do think that it's worth pointing out that most of the time when I play using gyro, it's like a shooter, and analog triggers, they're not very important in a shooter. In fact, I would probably prefer digital inputs for shooters because that's more like a mouse click and there's less travel before they actually activate. So I guess I would give the gyro on the King Kong a C. Of course, later Valve could add the King Kong controller to actually show up in Steam as what it is instead of, aping X input or Switch Pro controllers. And if that happens, it would definitely improve this controller's rating, at least my rating of it. Overall, it feels like a lighter weight Xbox controller. They're nearly identical in shape, and this feels a little bit lighter. I'd put it at A tier, I guess. The comfort, I mean. The King Kong also has a macro button in order to learn inputs, but I never ever use these features. I prefer to just play the games, and if I want to do anything fancy with a controller, I would just use Steam Input to configure that. Of course, Steam Input can't do macros, but macros are rarely useful if you ask me. I also wish that the lights on the controller were facing the player instead of facing the TV, because whenever I try and pair this controller, I have to jump through a couple of hoops because I'm constantly looking at the top of the controller so that I can see, if I'm connected or not. Now, this is probably because as somebody who reviews a bunch of devices, I have a lot of devices, and as I go from one to the next, I'm always constantly unpairing and pairing stuff. If I were just connecting it to one PC, then I'm sure it would be something that I would never notice. Another feature that makes the King Kong controller unique is it's supposed to be able to swap the face buttons easily. I did get this controller as a review unit, and I don't think that they sent me the tool that swaps the buttons. So in order to get the A button on the bottom, I disassembled the entire controller and then swapped them from the back. It was kind of a pain, but I'm glad that I did it because it matches almost all of my other controllers. This is the 8BitDo Ultimate, which retails for about $70. It has offset sticks like the Xbox controller. The top of the sticks feels like the stick tops on the PlayStation controller, which kind of dings it a point for me, but they're also Hall effect, which negates that point deduction. They rotate really smoothly. I feel like they've got decent throw, and I feel like I've got really good control on them. Here, check out the joystick tester in Steam. I'm not getting that crazy jump that I did with the King Kong sticks, and if you skipped over the King Kong sticks, go back and see that weird jump. These sticks get an A. The D-pad on this controller is really good. You don't have to push it very hard in order to actuate it, and it passes the Iron Meat test and Street Fighter tests with flying colors. Still, I don't like this D-pad as much as I do the Xbox controller, so I think that this is going to get an A. The face buttons drive me crazy on this controller, though. They're very similar to Xbox controller buttons, although they feel like they're raised up just a little bit more. I feel like there's a lot of resistance when pushing these buttons. I just bought this controller, though, just so I could make this video. So it's like the newest controller that I have here in the NerdNest, and maybe it's something that I would get used to over time, or would kind of have, break in over time. But that isn't my real problem with this controller. My real problem is that the buttons are in the wrong place for me. Luckily, in Steam, you can change the button order to the Nintendo button layout, but every time I do, every time I'm told to press Y, my brain goes for the wrong button. I'd almost prefer the buttons not to have labels at all and just have arrows instead of, like ABXY. Face buttons, they get a B on this. The triggers on the 8BitDo Ultimate feel great. They have a decent throw and a good resistance. I have no complaints about that, but they don't have the trigger rumble or feedback that the Xbox controller does. And I gave that controller a B on the triggers, so that I think that this one has to get a C. Still, they're good. They're just not as good as Xbox and PlayStation controllers. Rumble on the 8BitDo is decent as well. I'd say probably a B, and you do have the ability to adjust that on Windows if you like. I suppose I should mention that you can also add macros to the controller in that same software that you use to adjust the rumble. Though, like I said earlier, it runs into the same issue that the King Kong controller does. This one is detected by Steam as an Xbox controller, so that means you get the same choices as the King Kong. You can choose gyro with digital triggers, or you can choose analog triggers and no gyro. That means that it gets the same score, at least until Valve updates Steam to recognize this controller. Gyro gets a C. As far as comfort, I would say that's a C as well. The handles are a little short compared to the other controllers that I have. It feels like just a little bit smaller in my hand, and I don't feel like my hand has as much to hold on to. Onto its unique features, it comes with a charging dock, which is really cool. Remember that PlayStation charging dock that I mentioned earlier? It's kind of like that, only I don't have to fight with it to get the controller seated properly. And it comes with a wireless dongle, so you don't have to mess with Bluetooth. And as soon as you take it off the dock, it connects, and then when you put it back on the dock, it automatically disconnects, which is incredibly useful. I despise fighting with Bluetooth and getting different controllers to connect to different devices. This is an absolute win for somebody like me. You can also use the software to set up the back paddles. I have P1 set to the A button and P2 set to the B button. This is nice, but going back into the 8BitDo software to make changes is kind of a pain. You can swap profiles with a button press on the front. I just wish Valve would recognize this controller as its own thing and let me do everything through Steam input, because that would actually turn those back paddles into extra inputs. Moving on to the Anbernic RG-P01, which is their first controller, which was also sent to me for review, just like the King Kong was. First of all, we have to talk about the price, because this thing is listed for $18. However, keep in mind that if you buy one of these, you're also paying $12 for shipping, which still makes it the cheapest controller on this list. But I don't like the idea that they say it's $18, because it isn't. If you buy two of these controllers, the shipping now doubles to $24, which means Anbernic is really hiding the price of this controller, which is $29, and they're hiding that cost in the shipping. It feels kind of skeevy. I'm not really a fan of this practice, but I'm sure that you will see tons of articles about the $18 controller. So as far as marketing goes, it probably was a smart move, even if I don't particularly like it. Speaking of things that I don't like, the sticks have RGB around them. Yes, I can turn it off by cycling through the options, but the controller doesn't remember the setting that you set it at the last time that you used it, so you're kind of stuck with it, or you have to hit the button a billion times. It certainly isn't a big deal, but I don't like these. I don't like it anyway, so, that's going to be a ding. These sticks also feel really cheap. It's very little resistance when you are tilting them, and the thumb cap feels almost flat on top. All that together gives these sticks a D, I think. But for a controller that costs less than $30, it's hard to complain about, cheap stuff. The D-pad surprised me as well. It looks just like the 8BitDo D-pad, so I thought it would feel the same, but it's much taller than the 8BitDo D-pad, so it feels very different. I feel like the Iron Meat test, I'm getting tons of accidental diagonals in this, but in Street Fighter I had no problem with Hadoukens or Shoryukens. The D-pad's height and the fact that it's bad at the Iron Meat test means I have to knock it down to a C. The face buttons are baffling to me. First of all, the layout is really strange. It's like someone took the normal diamond formation that we have had on our controllers for decades and stretched it sideways. The feedback feels fairly similar to the King Kong controller. I'm not a fan. I'm going to say that the B button is also a little bit higher than the rest of the face buttons. Overall, I don't like it. It's absolutely something I could get used to, but for me, the face buttons are a D. The triggers have a very short throw. You hit your stopping point very quickly, which again, I'm not a fan of, but they are Hall effect triggers, although I don't care about Hall effect triggers nearly as much as Hall effect sticks, but there you have it. I was going to give the triggers a D, but there's a controller coming up later that has triggers that are actually worse than this, so I think a C is going to be fair. I have no complaints about the rumble. It's a B, and Anbernic suffers from the same issue as all the other controllers in this category. It has gyro, but only in Nintendo Switch mode, so gyro gets a C. You got to pick and choose what features you get to use. Steam, please support all controllers. As far as comfort, I feel like this is almost exactly the same shell as the 8BitDo controller, which means it has short handles, so there's another C there. The back buttons are great though. You don't have to load it into software in order to program them. They don't show up in Steam input, as either Steam detects this controller as an Xbox 360 controller of all things. But if you want to program them on the fly, all you have to do is hold down the M button on the back, then press the minus button, then pick the button or buttons that you want to be the input by the M button, and then press the M button again, and it's programmed. It's really fast. It doesn't give you extra inputs though. I will say that you can also set up macros in this same way. You just press the plus button instead of the minus button when you go to program it. It also comes with a wireless receiver, so you don't have to deal with Bluetooth if you want, which is great. but it wouldn't remember the pairing that I had, so I had to repair it each time I turned it on. I think maybe I was doing something wrong. Right now, listening to this, it probably feels like I am panning the Anbernic pretty hard, but the parts are just not very good. However, it's also less than $30, and I don't know of other controllers with this feature set for that price. I guess you get what you pay for. And speaking of getting what you pay for, let's talk about Pro controllers. I don't want to spend too much time on these because they are so similar to their non-Pro counterparts. Starting with the Xbox Elite 2, which costs $180. Now, I don't actually have one of these here in the NerdNest, but I have used one before, and it feels just like the Series X controller with a few tweaks. Number one, you can swap out the sticks and the D-pad. You also have the ability to adjust the tension on the sticks, which means you can get it feeling exactly how you want it. I think this takes the sticks from an A on the Series controller to an S on the Elite controller. When I used it, I really liked it a lot. Very, very comfortable. I think the swappable D-pad also means that you get to have the D-pad that you prefer, which again pushes this D-pad all the way up to the double S rank. The face buttons are the same, but they're programmable, which is cool. I don't think that really improves them all that much, especially since when connected to Steam input, I can just program buttons on any controller that I want that way. So, same score. The triggers would have been the same, but this controller has trigger locks, which means you can turn them into digital triggers. This is a feature I wish every controller had, which brings those triggers from a B up to an A. Rumble is about the same on both. Comfort is about the same on both, so same score for both of those. And then there's no gyro, again, NA. I think a lot of people would scoff at the $180 price, but it is frequently on sale, and it's also not the most expensive controller on this list. That goes to the DualSense Edge, which is up next. Just like the Xbox Elite controller, I'm going to compare the DualSense Edge directly to its cheaper sibling. I only want to talk about the scores that are different. The D-pad, the gyro, and comfort all stay the same. The sticks get a bump in score simply because I can swap out the caps, although I will point out that PlayStation software, you also can adjust the stick's response curve. I tried it, I didn't really care, and I ended up leaving it at default. Perhaps that would change the score for you, but for me, it didn't. Also, the fact that you can replace the sticks quite easily with replacement modules means you don't have to rebuy the entire controller if it starts drifting. I think that's very cool. I think that the sticks get bumped up to an A on the Edge. I like them a lot, but they're not perfect. The triggers are up from an A to an S, and this is easily my favorite triggers. All the cool shit that you can do with the triggers on the default controller is here, and they have trigger stops which you can switch to digital inputs for shooters if that's what you want. I love that feature. They also have 2 extra buttons that can be seen as extra buttons on the back of the controller, and you have options between lever style inputs or half moon inputs. I switch back and forth all the time. I can never decide which ones I like more. But this is probably my favorite controller on this list, and it better be for $200. Just about all of the controllers that we've looked at so far would be perfectly fine for retro games. But like I said before, right tool for the right job. The M30 from 8BitDo is absolutely my favorite controller for retro games. Number one, it is based off the 6-button Sega Genesis or Mega Drive controller, hence the M30 name. It has the ABC and XYZ buttons, and I've put a stupid amount of time into using this controller when playing Sega games on my emulation system. It has a Sega-style D-pad, which is one of the best D-pads of all time for me. I absolutely love how this D-pad feels when I'm playing retro games. Because this controller is built for retro games, I'm only testing it on retro games. Here you can see that it is really impressive for the Contra test, which is what I based the Iron Meat test on for all of the other controllers. I can easily hit the diagonals without doing it accidentally. In Street Fighter, I can hit the Hadoukens easily, but the Shoryukens I miss way more than I'd like. I think this is because you're ending on a diagonal with Shoryuken, and it just kind of feels off with this style of D-pad, but for most of your retro games, this is going to be absolutely fine. So it gets a B. The face buttons are amazing because it has 6 of them. This does mean that you'll have to jump through a few hoops in order to configure it on different systems, but if you love Sega Genesis games like I do, this controller is perfect for it. Face buttons are S tier for what this controller is made for. That's a big qualifier that I think is important. The back of the controller has a scoop for your fingers, which makes it easy to hold. I really wish that scoop was deeper just to give my fingers a little bit more to grip onto, or if they had a texture on the back that was slightly different than the front. There is room for improvement here, so it gets a C in the comfort department. Anyone that's watched my channel for any length of time knows that I am a huge fan of the Steam controller. I feel like the Steam controller, it's something where it's greater than the sum of its parts. As I went through and I ranked the different parts of the Steam controller, it gets pretty low scores, but the versatility that the controller has elevates it way beyond any of the arbitrary letters that I'm assigning it. Let's start with the stick. There's just one, and of all the sticks on this list, I think that the Steam controller, maybe not the worst, but it's pretty close. It's dome-shaped on the cap, which I really don't like. The throw is fine, but given the option, I would choose the trackpads over the joystick almost every single time. If the stick had an indent for your thumb on the top, I might change that to a C, but as it stands, I feel like this is a D tier thumbstick. Moving on to the D-pad, I wasn't sure if I should put NA or actually give it a score for the D-pad. The fact that they put the D-pad shape kind of engraved or embossed into the left trackpad makes me feel like I have to give it a score of some kind. And I guess if I have to give it a score, I would give it an F because it's terrible. I mean, you can do some crazy shit in Steam Input to make it better, but a real D-pad is infinitely superior to the left trackpad for D-pad related things. The face buttons on the Steam controller are maybe the worst Steam face buttons that are on this list. I think maybe ever, in fact. They're very small, they're very close together, they're very round on top, which I really don't like. They're also kind of hard to reach because of the shape of the controller. We'll get to the shape of the controller in a minute. These get an F. However, the triggers on the Steam controller are fantastic. They have a 2-stage system where you can pull soft in order to give one input, but if you pull all the way, you get a nice, satisfying click at the end of that pull for a second input. This is something I think every controller manufacturer should do, and I don't think that they ever will. Hell, even Valve completely abandoned that design on the Steam Deck. Steam Input lets you fake it, but that actual feedback that you can feel with that click is clutch when you're playing games and using that feature. Triggers on the Steam controller get an S from me. Valve seems to have some kind of aversion to actual real rumble. It probably stems from them being PC focused for so long, where rumble isn't even a consideration. The Steam controller doesn't have real rumble. It has haptic feedback, which is great on the trackpads, but horrible for a substitute for rumble. I would have marked this NA if they weren't trying to fake rumble using those haptics, but since they are faking rumble with the haptics, I have to give it a grade, and therefore it gets a D. The Steam controller was the first controller that I used for gyro for aiming. And the fact that it's automatically activated and deactivated based on whether or not you're touching that right trackpad is absolutely fantastic. The Steam controller gets an S tier for gyro. It is one of, if not, well, it's one of the best. Comfort for the Steam controller is really strange. You can't hold it like a traditional controller. It's more like you are cradling it in your fingers instead of holding it with the palms of your hands. And I think this is why the button placement is where it is, but I still don't really like it. Using it every day, it's something you absolutely would get used to it. It will feel comfortable, but then if you pick up a more traditional controller for about 10 minutes and then you go back to the Steam controller, I don't know about you, but my brain says, what is this fresh hell? Like, my hands are suddenly wondering what this weird foreign object is because the shape is so strange compared to traditional controllers. So I have to give the comfort. I'm struggling between a C and a D, and I think I'm going to land on a D. But what makes the Steam controller unique are these trackpads. It used to also be Steam Input, but Steam Input does a lot with almost any controller these days. So the trackpads are where it's at. This is what makes the Steam controller, according to most people. There's so much that you can do with them. You can use them as a mouse. You can set one to be a scroll wheel. You can put radial menus on them. You can bind a stupid number of inputs to the trackpads. The right trackpad is fantastic for first-person shooters or third-person shooters for pretending to be a trackball. Basically, with your thumb, you flick it, and the ball will feel like it just keeps rolling with momentum. It feels really good. As a combination of the trackpads and the haptics and the Steam Input, take the Steam controller far beyond the letter grades that I've assigned to it. But we will get to that in a moment. I'd probably say most of you have never seen one of these. This is the Alpaca controller, which is, it's a misnomer. It's not really a controller. It's a mouse and keyboard shaped like a controller. It has a joystick that's not really a joystick. It's literally WASD. A weird hat switch that gives you up to 9 inputs depending on which way you flick it. The face buttons sit on top of a capacitive platform so the controller knows when you're touching it or not. And it has a scroll wheel for weapon selection. I have a full review of this controller. I'll link that down below the like button. But let's talk about its scores, starting with the stick. This is WASD inputs, and it doesn't allow for analog. So you can't push it just a little bit in order to walk and then push it all the way in order to run. And because of this joystick, it has to get an F. The D-pad is a D-pad, but depending on the game that you're playing, it won't always work like a D-pad because, again, this is just a keyboard and mouse. So there's going to be a lot of times where you go to use the D-pad like a D-pad, and it won't behave the way that you are expecting to because each part of the D-pad is separate. You can't really get diagonal. So the Iron Meat test and the Street Fighter tests, they don't really apply here. Again, it's not really a D-pad, but it's shaped like a D-pad, so I gotta give it a score, and I think that score is going to be F. The face buttons on the Alpaca are fine, although, again, I have to point out, this is not a controller, it's a keyboard, so if the game tells you to press X, it's not going to be where you think it is. This is something you would probably, again, get used to over time, but when you are first starting out, it is incredibly frustrating trying to remember what all of the buttons do, especially since none of them are labeled. So the face buttons, I think I'm going to give them either a D or an F, probably an F, I think. The triggers are digital triggers, like a mouse. There are no degrees of clicking. You either are clicking or you are not clicking, and that's great when you're playing shooters. It's terrible for almost everything else. The triggers would get a D from me, except they work really well for shooters. It's not super useful otherwise, but it is really useful. I feel like it's unfair to give it a low score because it does what it's designed to do extremely well. It gets an F for comfort. It's literally 3D printed and you can feel all of those sharp edges. I just hate holding this thing. So it sounds like I'm saying it's a garbage controller, right? Well, hold the phone because this has the best gyro I have ever used in a controller. In fact, it has 2 gyroscopes. One that detects quick movements and the other one for very fine and precise movements. On every other controller with gyro, you definitely feel like you are faking something. But with the Alpaca controller, you feel, or at least I feel, like there's a pointer physically attached to the controller on a stick, and when I move it around when I move the controller around, it moves the pointer around the screen in a one-to-one movement. It feels like you are holding a mouse in your hand, and it's awesome. The gyro is the entire reason that you get one of these, or rather why you would build one of these, because you need to build it yourself. You can't buy it. But it's amazing, and once you feel it, you will wonder why anyone else is doing it any other way. Gyro on the Alpaca controller gets a double S rating. The HoriPad Steam controller is currently only available in Japan, but pre-orders just went up on Amazon for its release here in the States. I had it for about a month at this point, and I have a full deep dive review on it linked down below, but I figured I would also include it because it's obviously something people are interested in based on nothing else other than just how many of you watched my review of it. The sticks are Hall effect, which is great to hear. They're also capacitive, just like the Steam Deck. So that means that they know when you're touching them and when you're not. This means you can use them to activate gyro just like you do on the Steam Deck and Steam controller. I would like to mark them S tier based on that, but the caps on the top of the sticks are very flat on top, and I don't like the lack of a thumb depression. So I think that the sticks on the HoriPad get an A. The D-pad is also a mixed bag. I got tons of accidental diagonals in Iron Meat, but it's very easy to pull off Hadokens and Shoryukens. That said, it's also kind of a pointy D-pad. It rises up quite a bit off of the shell of the controller. And when I was using it to play fighting games, I could definitely see it feeling fatiguing on your thumb after a while. I'm going to give the D-pad a D rating for the HoriPad. The face buttons are flat, tall. They're fine, I guess. Nothing exciting about them. They're going to get a B. The triggers are laughable. Yes, they are analog technically, but the amount of travel is so small that they may as well be digital triggers. It's nearly impossible to see any kind of subtlety when pressing the triggers, so I'm going to give them a D, although they are good for shooters. It doesn't have any rumble, but it does have gyro, and the gyro is just as good as it is on the Steam controller and the Steam Deck because of those capacitive thumbsticks. This is a very good controller for shooters, and it's also very comfortable. The grips are just right. I feel like your fingers wrap right around the handles perfectly, and your fingers land on the back buttons, which is very important. They are recognized by Steam as their own buttons. This means all of the issues that I had with other third-party controllers that were recognized as either Xbox controllers or Switch controllers, where you had to make a decision between one set of features and another, that is not an issue here because the HoriPad is fully integrated into Steam, and that's awesome. Comfort, I would give them an A, and integration with Steam is fantastic. I already talked a bit about what makes this controller unique, those capacitive sticks, but it also has two buttons on the front of the controller near the base. I would have preferred these to be on the back, but they work really well on the front for activating radial menus on the sticks or something like that. If you want to know how to do that kind of thing on a controller like this, I have a short tutorial on my review of that controller, so make sure that you check out that video next. Okay, so let's see these scores. Then I want to talk about which games each controller is good for. Remember, all of this is subjective, so if you disagree on any of it, let me know down below. Next up, which genres do I use each controller for? And there's a lot of overlap here, but for fighting games, if I'm not using my arcade cabinet, I think that the Xbox Series controller is probably the best move because I absolutely love that D-pad. For platformers, I think we're pretty well tied between the Xbox Series controller, the 8BitDo Ultimate, and the M30, although the M30 is really only for retro games, although most of the platformers I play are retro games. For shooters, I vastly prefer the Steam controller to anything else, but those are really hard to find. So if you can't get your hands on a Steam controller, then I would either pick up the HoriPad Steam, which is coming out soon, or the DualSense Edge. Both are going to be really good for shooters. Don't pick up the HoriPad for racing games, though. For racing games, I think that the DualSense or the Edge are the way to go. They both have amazing haptic feedback and rumble, plus their triggers are really great. And Gran Turismo 7's feedback on this controller has completely spoiled all other racing games for me. If you're talking about retro games, I think all the controllers are just about equal, with the exception of the M30, which is built for retro, and it's really cheap. I think that that's probably the right move. For me, the best all-around controller, if you're looking for just one controller to rule them all, a multitasker, I guess that would probably be the DualSense or the DualSense Edge. It's the kitchen sink of controllers. It easily has the most features, and its weak battery life is negated by just plugging it in if you want to get rid of that issue. I'd like to also give an honorable mention here to the Steam controller. If you can get your hands on one, it's greater than the sum of its parts, and Valve needs to do something to bring this thing back, especially if they're going to making hardware to hook up to TVs, which I'm assuming is happening sooner rather than later. But what do you think about all these controllers? Which one is your favorite and why? Let me know in the comment section down below. And if you enjoyed this video, click on that like button. It helps out a ton. From the Nerd Nest, I'm Bill. Stay rad, and thanks for watching.